So we're talking today about the scientific revolution of the 17th century and asking some basic questions about what it was. But before I get into that, I want to say a couple of words about my approach to the subject. Since this is for a history class, not for a science class or for a history of science class, our primary interest lies in teasing out the ways in which the scientific revolution, that is to say, with the activity of scientists in scientific circles, the impact it had on European life, much more than the actual content of the scientific work itself. That's point number one. Point number two is that, ironically or not, it's interesting to me that because much of what we'll be talking about is really a set of conversations between scientists, there's a way in which the subject is really, in some ways, very much like Jewish cultural history in the sense that it's a kind of a commentary. That is to say, there is a work, let's say, Ptolemy in the second century before the second century of the Common Era, who's making certain claims about mathematics and about the universe. And then someone like Copernicus comes along almost a millennium and a half later in the 15th and 16th century, and he's, in effect, writing a kind of a commentary on Ptolemy. The reason why I'm emphasizing this notion of commentary is because one of the primary things that we're going to be talking about, both in terms of what science actually consists of, which is the empirical method of research, that itself is historical, meaning that the notion of a person having an idea about the universe, the physical, natural universe, and saying not just, well, I have a certain idea and I want to comment on somebody else's prior idea, but that I actually want to do an experiment. I have an idea about somebody else's idea, and to test my idea, I'm going to do an experiment. I'm going to try to observe something about the universe, and then I'm going to run an experiment, and by virtue of what I learn from that experiment, I will either decide that my idea was more true than the previous view of that idea, or it's less true. That in and of itself is partly what we're talking about. That is to say, the rise of empiricism. So, for example, when you look at this picture of Rembrandt's painting of the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, we see here that medicine itself is making progress in the 17th century, which is what Rembrandt is depicting. Excuse me. And notice that the activity, the scientific medical activity that's being depicted by Rembrandt is the dissection of a cadaver, which was a controversial part of the new emerging medical education and very much a part of this emerging culture of empiricism. So let me say a few words by way of introduction, and then we can talk about a little bit of science and the social and cultural impact of science. During the 16th and 17th centuries, science had created a new view of the universe that challenged many previously held beliefs. The Earth moved from the center of the universe and became only one of several planets orbiting a sun that was one of only countless stars. This new cosmology forced people to rethink humanity's place in the larger scheme of things. The new scientific ideas came into apparent conflict with traditional religion and raised doubts about the grounds for faith and morality. The Europeans discovered a world that was much more complex than the one that their ancestors had imagined. The telescope opened the heavens to them, while the microscope disclosed the existence of a realm of microorganisms. A spate of scientific discoveries added to the intellectual dislocation already created by the Reformation and contact with the New World. So let's talk specifically now about the scientific revolution, which I'm defining as the emergence in the 16th century of rational and empirical methods of research that challenged traditional thought and promoted the rise of science and technology. Now, the process, this notion of the scientific revolution, that terminology we should use carefully, because not everything in this so-called new science was necessarily new. 16th and 17th century natural philosophers were often re-examining and rethinking theories and data from the ancient world in the late Middle Ages. The word revolution oftentimes denotes rapid collective political change that involved many people, and here we're talking about a scientific revolution that was not rapid. It was a complex movement with many false starts and brilliant people suggesting wrong as well as useful ideas. Nor did it involve more than a few hundred people who labored in widely separated studies in crude laboratories located in far-flung places like Poland, Italy, Denmark, Bohemia, France, and Great Britain. Also, the achievements of the new science were not simply the function of isolated, brilliant scientific minds. These leading figures of the scientific revolution often drew on the aid of artisans and craftspeople to help them construct new instruments for experimentation and to carry out those experiments. Finally, because the practice of science involves social activity as well as knowledge, the revolution also saw the establishment of new social institutions to support the emerging scientific enterprise. Natural knowledge was only in the process of becoming science as we know it today during the era of the scientific revolution. In fact, the word scientist, which was only coined in the 1830s, didn't yet exist in the 17th century, nor did anything resembling the modern scientific career. Individuals devoted to natural philosophy might work in a university, or in the court of a prince, or even in their own homes and workshops. Only in the second half of the 17th century did formal societies and academies devoted to the pursuit of natural philosophy come into existence. Although new knowledge emerged in many areas during the 16th and 17th centuries, including medicine, as we see in the Rembrandt painting, chemistry, and natural history, the scientific achievements that most captured the learned imagination and persuaded people of the cultural power of natural knowledge were those that occurred in astronomy.